The first State of the Nation address under South Africa's first coalition government. President Cyril Ramaphosa says his country will not be bullied, while praising progress made and changes to come under the government of national unity. But amid rising unemployment and challenging foreign relations, we'll ask our panelists what they think after 7 months of coalition politics. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is South Africa. Well, back in June, South Africans faced a political shakeup when the party that ruled the country since the end of apartheid lost its majority. For the first time, liberation hero Nelson Mandela's ANC had to share power with its main rival, the Democratic Alliance. But so far, the government of national unity has remained stable, and they'll need that stability in the face of numerous challenges, both domestic and from abroad. With the U.S. pointing a finger directly at South Africa for anti-Americanism, President Ramaphosa says his country will not be bullied. Here's a look now at what South Africa is up against.
The unlikely union between the African National Congress and its main rival, the Democratic Alliance, is holding firm. But South Africa is mired in economic problems and potential foreign difficulties. The country suffers from 32% unemployment, even higher among the youth. A high crime rate still plagues the world's most unequal country, and severe water shortages are hampering basic services and businesses. There have been some improvements, though. Power cuts are becoming less frequent, and more investment has begun to pour in. In his State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa promised a new wave of reforms to reduce poverty and create jobs and economic growth.
While we may differ on many issues, we agree on one thing: that we need to build a better South Africa and improve the well-being of our people.
One issue that the ANC and DA partners differ on is the new land expropriation law. In January, Ramaphosa signed the act allowing the state to seize properties without compensation for public purposes. Unequal land distribution is a legacy of racial discrimination during apartheid, with white South Africans owning 70% of the land, despite making up only 7% of the population. The DA opposed the law and is taking it to court. And the issue turned global after US President Donald Trump wrote on his Truth social media platform that South Africa is treating classes of people very badly and cut off all future aid funding to the country.
That's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
That was followed by the South African-born tech titan and Trump ally Elon Musk weighing in, calling the law openly racist. Musk had previously accused Ramaphosa's government of allowing genocide over the killing of white farmers, a myth that is dismissed by experts. Ramaphosa talked with Musk on the phone and warned about misinformation and distortions. And on Thursday, he said South Africa will not be bullied.
We are witnessing the rise of nationalism, protectionism, the pursuit of narrow interests, and the decline of common cause. This is the world that we, as South Africa, a developing economy, must now navigate. But we are not daunted to navigate our path through this world that constantly changes. We will not be deterred.
Ramaphosa also touched on the HIV programs, as US aid makes up 17% of its treatment and support works. He said the country that has the highest number of HIV patients in the world is now looking for ways to continue providing essential services. The conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is adding further strain to foreign relations. At least 14 South African peacekeepers have been killed there in the fight against M23 rebels. But so far, the government of national unity is looking stable. Its real test of bringing widespread improvement to the lives of South Africans continues.
So let's ask three various party representatives how they're feeling about the state of their nation. And joining me now from Johannesburg is Head of Policy and Research at the ANC National Executive Committee, Febe Potgieter-Gqubule. From Cape Town, President of the African Transformation Movement, Vuyo Zungula. And from Cape Town as well, National Spokesperson for the Democratic Alliance, Karabo Khakhau. Thanks all so much for being with me. I'm going to begin by asking a member of an opposition party what you made of the address. Did it address the real issues you think South Africans are facing?
Not at all. Not at all, because the key issues that South Africa is facing, it is the high levels of poverty and unemployment. We are currently sitting at 63% poverty rates in our country. The president spoke about 28 million South African citizens who are dependent on social grants for assistance. Now, that is not a sustainable way of addressing poverty, because the stats are there to show that there are only 7% South Africans who are taxpayers. Now, it means that we're going to have a problem if we are going to have a high dependency on the state for the majority of the citizens. The only way in South Africa to deal with the issues of poverty and unemployment is mass industrialization, not a case whereby there's going to be a high level of dependency on social grants that is coming from a government that is struggling now to raise money, because even the Minister of Finance has alluded in the past budget speeches about the impediments of the government. That is why you have a case whereby the budgets for some of the departments have been reduced because of the inability for the government to have the money they need in order to provide services for the respective departments.
Okay, I can see Karabo disagrees, but I mean, Karabo, some have said before that poverty is South Africa's kind of ticking time bomb. Do you feel it's been addressed better than what Vuyo was describing, and that going forward it will be reduced at least?
So Zungula is playing politics here, and he's being quite frankly disingenuous, because at the heart of President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address was the agenda that the Democratic Alliance has always set out to be the best solution towards addressing poverty and inequality in South Africa, which are 1, job creation, and 2, economic growth. And we've seen there are 7 key priorities that come straight from Democratic Alliance cabinets that the president has spoken to. 1, the president spoke about a digital government, having a digital ID and e-services to cut red tape there. When you have a digital government there, you're able to correctly be able to pull in investment and make sure that business works accordingly. When you cut red tape, this is something that investors love. This is what brings money towards the economy. This is what creates jobs. 2, he spoke about a competitive energy generation market, talking about lowering costs and reliable power and getting us reliable power through reform. This is, again, another win for economic reform and job creation. He spoke about massive infrastructure and development for growth funds being made available to make sure that we deal with the development of our roads, our bridges, our dams, and our public transport upgrades. I don't understand why then Vuyo would say there's no talks about infrastructure there. Infrastructure is roads.
Okay.
When roads work, we're able to have things that work. He spoke about small harbors. He spoke about the investments in freight and rail. He spoke about a fully digital visa application systems to boost tourism and investment. He again also spoke about the growth of agricultural exports, speaking to the expansion of markets and supporting farmers there. And these are critical tools that the government can use to leverage private sector participation to create jobs and grow the economy. So he's quite frankly not being honest.
Okay, let me ask Febe, though, because, the DA seems to think that economic reform is definitely in the cards, that it's pragmatic the way the president outlined it. But I'd like to bring another reform issue into play with you. That is land reformation. The laws are also a major issue because it's affecting, somewhat curiously, foreign policy in a major way. And it is something that the DA and the ANC have really disagreed on moving forward. So is that getting resolved within the coalition?
As part of all 3 of the priorities which he outlined, which is poverty and economic growth and job creation, the question of land redistribution is an important issue. Because if one look at how other countries developed, and particularly the Asian tigers, what they've done quite early in their national development plans was to look at how do you give more people access to land so that people are able to stay in the rural areas and have sustainable livelihoods. So land redistribution is very critical to economic development, towards making sure that you don't have the rapid kind of urbanization that we've seen in South Africa. Now, the Expropriation Amendment Act is an act where there's lots of misunderstanding about. I mean, on the one hand, on the one extreme, you have AfriForum and others who claim that this is leading to land being taken away from white farmers, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, that government will just take away land without any compensation, referring to the Act. And if one, a careful reading of the Act basically consolidates South Africa's approach towards land redistribution as set out in the Constitution. So first, the first principle is that we need to have redress. Right. South Africa had a 1913 Land Act, it had the 1936 Land Act, it had the Group Areas Act that expropriated millions of South Africans from their land. So the Constitution correctly identified that there has to be a legal form of redress, and hence it's called on government, and as Parliament has now done, and the President signed, on putting in place a legal framework to allow for redress within the context of recognized...
Febe, let me ask you though, why, what you're explaining makes perfect sense. Why does it not appeal to the United States? Why has it caught the ire, specifically of President Trump and one of his chief advisors now, Elon Musk? They believe there's discrimination, and now it's making the entire country suffer as a result, because there'll be, cuts to about almost 20% of some of the U.S. aid that South Africa receives. Why? Why has this domino effect happened?
I think that part of the issue is that there is a segment of our society represented by the likes of AfriForum, who have been for years lobbied against transformation in our country. Lobbied against bringing more Black people into the economy, more women, more young people, expanding the economy to townships and rural areas where the majority of Black people live. Secondly, a key area of disagreement with the likes of AfriForum has been around the question about land redistribution. And they've been lobbied. They've obviously found common cause with some of the right wing in the United States and other parts of the world. And this is the difficulty that we see at the moment. I mean, when they are being challenged, as they've been done by senior journalists, to ask, so are you saying that you support cuts to people who need antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS because you don't want to see land reforms? They're very ambiguous about it. But our position as South Africa is that you won't find peace in South Africa if you don't address the historical injustice. And part of that historical injustice is land. And what the Expropriation Act now is a legal way of doing that.
Understood. But let me ask Vuyo then, because President Ramaphosa said that South Africa will not be bullied in the face of real consequences now for standing up to Israel in particular, as well as land reforms. So in your opinion going forward, how uncompromising will or should South Africa be now in its foreign policy decisions that could anger the U.S. at the cost of punishing some of South Africa's poorest, as for example, those needing AIDS medications that come through U.S. aid?
As a country, this should be a wake-up call to say, how do we retain our sovereignty in a manner that allows only the South African government to dictate our domestic policies in line with our national interests? Because you find that at the heart of the spat with the USA, it is the USA threatening South Africa to say, if you don't take a particular direction in terms of your policies. We are going to cut aid, we are going to sanction you, which does not work in the best interest of the country. We want to applaud the president of the country by being firm in terms of assuring South Africans that will not be bullied, and all decisions that are going to be taken by the government will be in the best interest of the people of the country. However, the president missed an opportunity to really address AfriForum, because as Febe stated, it is AfriForum that has gone across the international community, misleading and creating misinformation to the international community about what is happening in our country. So we would hope that the president and the government would really deal with the South African citizens and the NGOs in South Africa that are going around peddling these lies that lead into the international community having a negative and damning outlook in terms of what's happening in our country.
Understood. Karabo, then same question for you. I mean, how uncompromising should South Africa be on the stance that it takes on Israel and land reformation as dictated even by its own constitution?
Let's do this first, right? Andrea, there's a bit of a misconception. So what is true, and I think all three of the panelists can agree with, is the fact that the information that President Trump's administration has about the state of affairs in South Africa as far as land issues are concerned is false. So that is what needs to be clarified, and we're glad in the GNU that the Ramaphosa administration is engaging the Trump administration to clarify these contradictions. But what must also be clear for South Africans and the world to understand the DA's position is this, Andrea. The Democratic Alliance believes that a democratic dispensation should be true to its constitution and nothing else. The South African constitution has a clear protection of property rights, while at the same time having a clear agenda as per Section 25 of the Constitution for land reform, redress, and restitution. And so government's agenda to address the injustices of the past must be able to protect both these rights and privileges in the Constitution. So this means when you deal with expropriation in the country, you do so with property value that is aligned to market value, one, so in cases of compensation. But two, when there is cases of dispute that exists for either person on the negotiating table, it shouldn't then the responsibility rest on the shoulders of people who are seeking dispute to seek the counsel of the courts at their own costs, because then it disadvantages whoever is not happy with the process. It does not even give us a fair procedure there altogether, and then it removes the state altogether from the responsibility they're supposed to take to make sure that we do have successful cases of land reform and restitution and land reform, restitution, and expropriation. Okay. Particularly because so these are the things that we need to consider. And the other thing that we also need to consider, when rolling out the Expropriation Act, we need to make sure that the Act itself meets constitutional muster, that there isn't a contradiction at all on the procedure to be followed for expropriation. And as is the case, there are two processes that are in direct contradiction with each other that need to be cleared out. And that's why the Democratic Alliance has called to say that this bill must go back to Parliament to thresh out these problems so that we can stay true to our Constitution, as we have already shown as the Democratic Alliance that we can do so in the Western Cape.
So, Febe, does that make sense to you as far as land reform is concerned? Because like I said before, the DA and the ANC have clashed on that issue many times. Are you now on the same page? Is it going forward strongly under this coalition government, or could this cause, I don't want to exaggerate, but even the disintegration of a coalition partnership because this issue is so fundamental?
Well, I think that on the one hand, the constitutionality of the Expropriation Act, AfriForum has said that they will take it to the Constitutional Court. We're still waiting to see that, because that's the ultimate arbiter of whether a particular piece of legislation is in line with our Constitution or not. So there's always been that avenue to take the matter to the Constitutional Court. Okay. The Expropriation Act has been passed by Parliament. The President, in accordance with the Constitution, signed the Act. So if there's a legal challenge, it will have to be heard by the Constitutional Court.
Fair enough.
I think that this matter will break the government of national unity. I think that all South Africans agree, whether you're for or against land reform, that you have to address the question about land restitution. Our constitution, in its in Section 25, is very clear about it. And it's at the center of the building of a South African nation.
Indeed. So it has to be addressed, but you agree that the United States has arguably deliberately misunderstood what's being done here. Very quickly, Febe, I'd like to ask you again about compromising, how far South Africa is willing to go with its policy toward Palestinians that has angered the current U.S. administration, as well as toward China. Because if it really comes down to South Africa having to take penalties from the United States, how firm should South Africa really stand?
Let me explain the two issues that you mentioned. The first one about what's happening in Palestine. There is no way that South Africa can compromise on not taking a position on a genocide that's unfolding before our eyes and that we are aware of. The contradiction of the statements by the US president, that on the one hand, he talks about land reforms in South Africa and condemning that. And on the other hand, you're saying that we're going to, as Americans, take over the Gaza Strip and build the Riviera of the Middle East there. I mean, it's just contradiction in terms. So the questions about, there is international precedent around the questions about what is genocide. The court has ruled on the matter. So we don't think that we should compromise on that in the interest of, it may happen in any other country again.
Let me just ask Vuyo, we're down to our last few minutes here. Is that perhaps the one larger issue that all parties involved in South Africa do agree on, that South Africa needs to stand firm against a power like the United States at whatever cost it comes?
Yeah, most of the parties, we've heard how they make their utterances on the USA issue. And the firm belief is to say South Africa is a sovereign country, and it will never bode well for South Africans if we allow a country, not only like America, but any other country, to dictate the future of our country in terms of our domestic policies, our interests, and our foreign policy. Even though there is trade agreements such as AGOA and other aid that is coming from America. But the sentiment in South Africa is to say what is in the best interest of South Africans. And if we're going to have a relationship with the USA, let it be on a matter of mutual respect, because we're a sovereign country. We can't be beggars to the USA. So that is the sentiment in South Africa. That is why, as even if we're an opposition party, but on the stance that has been taken by the government on this issue to say we are going to push back against any form of bullying by America, any form of wanting South Africa to change its stance about Palestine, because this is not really about the land situation or the land, the Expropriation Act, such as Febe has just explained, that you're going to have a president of America saying they're going to sanction South Africa or cut their aid based on the Expropriation Act. But on the other side, the president of America still says they're going to expropriate, in other words, the Gaza Strip. So this is about the actions that were taken by the South African government in reporting Israel that's committing genocide to the ICJ. So that is what this fight is all about.
And quickly, Karabo, do you think that stance in foreign policy can be well balanced with what South Africa's government needs to do to combat poverty, especially when it comes to the youth in South Africa, and perhaps any sort of developing relationship with other foreign powers, including China? Is there a balance to be found there?
Andrea, diplomacy is a very delicate game. and it takes a great deal of maturity and willingness to compromise if must, to a certain extent, to realize the outcome. The bottom line is that America remains a valued partner for South Africa, as the president did outline yesterday. What was also true is the fact that the South African government also has a mandate to address injustices of the past for its own South African people, but it at the same time also has a mandate to foster economic growth, pull in investment, and grow jobs for the South African people. And it is on the basis of that that the President Ramaphosa's administration and the GNU must then be able to find each other with the United States as far as clarifying the contradictions of what is happening in South Africa, so that we can move forward. I do not think we have to stay true to, I do not think that staying true to who we are must come at the cost of trade partnership that benefits not only poor South Africans, but future gains for economic growth.
Karabo, that will have to be the final word for this panel. I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with me. Well, let's get another perspective now from a South African journalist. And joining me from Johannesburg is the author of Thabo Mbeki and the Battle for the Soul of the ANC, William Gumede. Thanks so much for being with me. You know, politically, do you think South Africa is in good shape and South Africans are in good shape as well? Or has the coalition remained stable but still failing perhaps to address the majority of issues for South Africans?
Thank you for having me. I think we're in a better space than when the ANC was the majority party. You know, South Africa is the world's most diverse society, and it has been so in the last 30 years that one dominant party, one majority party cannot deliver on its own. And because the country is so diverse and our history is so diverse, we need coalitions, we need collaboration. And I think the country is in a much more hopeful space. And the hopeful space provide us this, you know, the opening and the space to grow the economy, to tackle undo poverty, and to create this job, the job. So we are now in the space to do it. If it was an ANC dominant government, we would have been now a country that would have felt very hopeless. Our energy would have been down. And I think the confidence in the government would have been very, very low.
Okay, so you feel, though, that the success of this coalition government is translating to a majority of South Africans. Perhaps some would argue that the benefits have yet to be revealed. You feel those are coming, if I haven't misunderstood. And you've said coalitions are the way forward for South Africa. But do you ever fear, you know, the often kind of paralyzing difficulties we've seen in cases like France, you know, Israel, many argue the UK? You don't worry that it could lead to less effective government in South Africa?
Yes, I mean, it is much better to have a coalition government in South Africa than a one-party dominant government. We've seen it because of the diversity of our country. Most of our political parties, sadly, are still based on the apartheid era way of politics. Many of our parties are either ethnic-based or color-based, or they're ideological based. So if one party comes to power and is dominant, then that party brings its ethnic focus or its color focus or its ideological focus. And then that party, as we've seen with the ANC, don't look at the interests of all South Africans. That is why it's so much better for the country. And despite the fact that coalitions, you know, demands hard work, it is still better because it brings multiple ideologies and political parties together.
Okay, then looking back at the State of the Nation address and viewing from the outside, there were several moments where it was kind of hard to discern if the president was being cheered or booed. But obviously there were some contentious issues being addressed. So what stood out to you?
I mean, I am very disappointed as somebody that's outside government. I don't think, you know, that the president has given us direction. It really has been a recycling of some of the past things that have been said. I mean, there are critical issues in South Africa. If we want to we need to get economic growth, and that must be at the top of our agenda. If we don't get economic growth, we can't, get job creation, and we can't deal with poverty. Now, to deal with poverty, for example, or to get at economic growth, we must cut corruption. It's at the top of it. I mean, if we cut corruption between 10 and 20%, it gives us 3% growth already. But the president was silent on that. Like, second one, we have to get rule of law in South Africa. No country can create jobs or deal with poverty if there's lawlessness. I mean, our country's in a state of lawlessness. Last week, for example, in the Mpumalanga province, taxi associations burned 50 public buses, and there's been no accountability. So we can't create growth, and we can't expand businesses in that context. I mean, we've got the highest murder rate in the world outside a war. Buildings and properties in South Africa are hijacked. We've got a construction mafia that takes over people's businesses and so on. So the president didn't say anything about it, because if we can reduce crime and lawlessness again by 10-20%, that gives us more growth. And then the state in itself, the president didn't talk about the ineffective state. I mean, South Africa's public service, part of our public service and state-owned entities are almost like failed states. And if we don't get it right, and if we don't clean it up, we're not going to get a growth. I'll just take the example of the president talk about fixing infrastructure. Now, you can't fix infrastructure in South Africa if the state-owned infrastructure companies like Transnet is dysfunctional.
Okay, William Gumede, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. And thanks, of course, to our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.